Anyway, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jackson Brainerd with the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'd like to welcome everyone to this session on the tax implications of the evolving retail industry. Fairly topic. Not only is the retail industry extremely important to state and local tax bases, but there's also a lot of developments taking place in this space. The continuing rise of e-commerce, news of slews of shopping mall closures, and then of course there's the recent Wayfarer decision and the elimination of the physical nexus standard, all of which have significant revenue consequences. So we'll hear from three speakers today on some of these changes affecting the retail industry, the effects these changes will have on state and local tax bases, and how states can respond to ensure the continued vitality of commercial districts. After they've all finished with their remarks, we'll open the floor to your questions. I just want to remind everyone that this session is being presented with audio and slides on our webinar platform and will be available after the meeting. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Natalie Cohen. Ms. Cohen is Managing Director and Head of Municipal Research with Wells Fargo. She was previously President of the National Municipal Research, Inc., an independent consulting company focused on state and local fiscal conditions. She's a member of the Municipal Analysts Group of New York, a member of the Budget Committee of the Government Finance Officers Association, and is well known for her studies and articles about municipal credit risk and bond defaults. Please welcome Natalie Cohen.
Thank you. Can you hear me all the way in the back, you guys? Yes? Okay, just checking. It would be warmer in the room if you all clustered, you know? Anyhow, so just to let you know a little bit about what I do, I head up the Municipal Research Group at Wells Fargo Securities, mostly focused on the financial side of things, and our group covers sectors. So I did a piece recently on some of the transformations going on in property sales, income tax, and physical brick and mortar, and how that's changing. And we also, in my group, I also have a person who covers all things infrastructure, higher education, housing, and healthcare. So we're sector-based. So if you're interested, please feel free. You're welcome to the research. There's no obligation or anything like that. So to the topic, the United States is very over-malled, and as many of you know, in many of your communities, malls have been closing down. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The places where they're closing down are typically where manufacturing jobs have been lost. It's basically common sense. People have less spending money, less likely to go to the mall and shop. The US has 4 times more retail than either Japan or France, 6 times more than England, 9 more than Italy, and 11 times more than in Germany. So it gives you an idea of some of the excess space that we have. And so given changes in manufacturing and dramatic changes in technology, we're also going to cover the online sales issue in this panel. Many of the malls are closing down. So instead of just focusing on the negative, I'm also going to talk a little bit about the positive and some of the transformations that are taking place with those spaces for different purposes and some of the positive developments. Interestingly, I also in the research follow the job changes, and if you look at the monthly job reports, there have been dramatic losses in the retail area. For example, I looked at December 16 to December 17, so it's just a 1-year time period. General merchandising stores lost 90,000 employees. Clothing and accessory stores lost 29,000. And furniture and furnishings dropped 7,000. So, you know, that was significant. And yet on the non-store retail, which is another category in the jobs, the pickup was only 17,000 over that time period. So online sales is a lot less labor intensive than the malls, the shopping centers, and the retail component that are being replaced by the person that you reach when you call in your sale, or not even anymore when you make those clicks on your on your computer. The GAO, as my colleagues may repeat this, but the GAO did a study in the online sales and estimated, there was an estimate from different studies of between 8 billion and 30 billion a year. GAO estimated that the loss to state and local government that could have been captured was about $13 billion. It's a lot of money that can come back. And so we're going to talk on the panel about post-Wayfarer and what that means. But onto the sort of the physical transformations, I did in this particular piece, did a spotlight on Ohio, which is one of the states. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky are the states. Is anyone from those states in the room? Okay, Ohio. Some of the changes in Columbus, Dayton, and Springfield, just by contrast. So what Columbus did was they tore down an old mall in the downtown area, and they greened it. They turned it into an open air. Festival comes to mind, but not really. It's more there's seating, and what they did was surrounded the mall with the grassy area with food and entertainment facilities, holding events and so on. And in fact, there has been some reports of increases in property value, so that would trigger off the property tax as opposed to the sales tax from the mall, but also sale of restaurant, food services, and entertainment attendance, and so on. So creating additional vitality in an area that had been somewhat of an eyesore in the downtown area. Other places like Dayton have been converting historic properties using the tax credit. Less of value now given tax reform, but that's still happening. Some of the older cities have historic buildings, and they're being used for micro multifamily housing, affordable housing, smaller shops, and in particular high technology office space. So using them as economic generators in an area, in a beautiful historic building. Those are some examples. Springfield, Ohio has also been named in a couple of studies as a place that was very hard hit by mall closings. They are a city that was 50% dependent on the income tax. And so the loss of jobs, the loss of the mall made a pretty big difference. They also are renovating a historic building to create a tech incubator and a couple of other facilities around to bring in technology, whether it's healthcare technology or or coding or new types of services. Interestingly, the city actually, the voters passed an income tax hike and also water and sewer rate hikes in order to give themselves some room to sort of redevelop some of those spaces. The other thing I wanted to bring up before I hand over to another panelist is that, it's important to be mindful of what the transformation is that is taking place and how that then ties into the tax revenues. So, for example, there are a couple of malls in the St. Louis metropolitan area where the anchor store is being converted into a tech a center for tech help, for call-in, and it's not producing sales tax, but it's producing jobs. So the question is, do you have an income tax in your community? But given that, filling that anchor store is a strong positive for the community, and the rest of the mall is now still used for the food court, for employees in the facility, for various services that you might find in, say, a strip center or something like that. So there's an architectural company in the St. Louis area that is actively engaged in redoing some of the shuttered facilities and replacing them. Some other examples are, 24-hour fitness centers. There are movie theaters. There are community colleges and educational entities that are going into anchor stores all around the country. So there is a lot that can be done, not necessarily to pull in more sales tax, but to retain the economic vitality. And along with that, I would like to just add a comment, and this came up in our calls, is to be careful not to give away the store, so to speak, because GASB has recently, within the last year or two, changed the accounting rules. GASB 77 is requiring disclosure of the various tax abatements and tax benefits that are given to corporations. I know there was a story recently about attracting San Bernardino, which went through a bankruptcy, attracting an Amazon packing warehousing facility. And in fact, you know, the jobs that were created were very part-time, and there's very high turnover there. So not necessarily creating the kind of high-paid jobs that you want to ultimately attract. So I did just want to mention that, and I'll be open to questions after my panelists go forward.
It's interesting, Natalie, you mentioned the Columbus City Center, because that's actually how I met my wife.
Oh my goodness, okay, all right.
She was at Jacobson's department store, which unfortunately went bankrupt.
Yes.
But it was a very prosperous mall when it first opened up, a lot of excitement because it was a downtown thriving mall. But you know, Columbus, the growth for the wealthier areas of the town was in the northern part, and two malls ended up opening in the northern part of Columbus, and unfortunately that pretty much made the city center no longer the new cool mall to go to. So ultimately it turned into, as you had indicated, a more beautiful green space now.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Next, I'd like to introduce Ron Rocco with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Massachusetts. Mr. Rocco is a fellow in the Valuation and Taxation Department and has been a frequent speaker on property tax and municipal finance issues. Prior to his role at Lincoln, Ron was the commissioner of the City of Boston Assessing Department, where he served for 25 years. He has recently served as the chair of the research committee of the International Association of Assessing Officers and was awarded that organization's Donahue Essay Award in 2013.
Thanks, Jackson. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, we're a group that, as our name implies, are very focused on issues relating to the use of land. Basically, it's stewardship, its use, and also its taxation. So when you talk about the taxation of land, obviously the property tax plays a very prominent role in that. I think we're fortunate to have an institution like Lincoln that is so focused on the property tax and really a big supporter of it. Because it is so important as part of our whole finance structure for state and local government, particularly for municipalities. Two of the key issues that we're focusing on at the Institute currently are municipal fiscal health and also value capture, which I know a lot of you have probably been spending some time on that as well as we look to funding infrastructure. So the property tax obviously plays an important role in both of those. But when we talk about what's happening in the retail world, you know, a lot of us, when we think about retail, we think about taxes, we think about the sales tax. But the retail market is also a very important part of the property tax base as well. So just a quick overview, just kind of put this into some context. Property tax revenues now account for about 35% of our total state and local revenue structure. But roughly 1/3. And it's been pretty consistent in that amount for a long amount of time. When you look at the retail sector of the property tax base, and when you look at of all commercial properties, retail is about 1/4 of all of our retail properties. So it's, again, a pretty significant chunk of our property tax base. Now, as Natalie mentioned, our retail environment in the United States certainly is changing, and it's changing pretty rapidly. As I was doing a little bit of reading in preparation for this session, a comment that I saw a couple times is that retail was undergoing changes not seen since the introduction of the shopping mall. You know, that had me scratch. I didn't realize the introduction of the shopping mall was such a watershed moment in human history. But clearly it was. And now that we're seeing some of those malls falling on hard times, it's equally important. So certainly the demise of the anchor department store is out there happening. We're seeing big changes in consumer behavior. There's a lot less spending on clothing and housewares. There's a lot more spending on dining out and other types of entertainment. And retail customers now, they're not just going to pick something up, they're also kind of looking for a more vibrant retail experience and being very selective in where they shop because of that. And as Natalie mentioned, and everyone knows, e-commerce is obviously also having a huge impact on brick and mortar retail. So when we start thinking about how these changes that are happening in the retail environment impact our property tax revenues, well, property taxes are based on valuations. So in order to capture that, we need to see how the changes are impacting those values. Now, most retail properties are bought and sold really on the basis of their ability to produce income. And there's a pretty basic capitalization formula that assessors use to turn that income into value. And it's really looking at the net income of the property and dividing that by its investment desirability. So there's some inputs that go into that. So on the top part of that line where we're looking at net income, it's really pretty simple relationships. There's the rent that the property commands, and if the rent goes up, the property becomes more valuable. As rents decrease, it becomes less valuable. Vacancy is a very important component. If you have a vacant mall, obviously that's going to be less valuable than one that is fully occupied. And then the capitalization rate, that's a little bit more of a nebulous concept, but it's really an overall measure of investment desirability. So what we're talking about there are things like the cost of equity, the cost of debt, and also just the risks that are associated with property. So if you have properties where there's high demand, a good economic situation, there's going to be less risk there than maybe someplace where incomes are declining, sales are down, and you have more vacancies. So to really see what's going on and how property taxes are being impacted, I went and looked at each of these components. So going back 10 years, if you look at the general retail rents that were in place in 2008 and looking to the first quarter of 2018, you'll see that overall retail rents went down a little bit during the years of the recession. That's not that surprising, but they've rebounded and they've actually grown in the last few years. So they're approximately now about the same place that they were before the recession. The story isn't the same though for shopping malls. There you'll see that shopping malls actually commanded a little bit more rent prior to the recession. They came down and they have recovered somewhat, but they're still significantly below the level they were in the last recession. And that sort of shows you some of the impacts that the changes in retail are having on their valuations. As I mentioned, one of the other key components is the vacancy rate. And if you look at the vacancy for retail, that top line is for all retail. So that includes your shops on your main street as well as properties and malls and power centers. That rate, again, increased a little bit during the recession, but for general retail, it's actually declined pretty substantially. It's down to about a 5% overall rate, a little bit less than that, which is actually considered pretty healthy overall. Again, the news for malls, again, is not quite as good. It went up and it came back down again, but the mall vacancy rate is still slightly above what it was pre-recession. And then finally, I thought kind of the best way to reflect the whole investment desirability component of this, and I think it also kind of confirms our story here. There's a group, there's a study called the Real Estate Research Corporation. It's done by PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Urban Land Institute. And what they do is they survey a bunch of actors in the real estate markets, people who have purchased properties, finance properties, and whatnot. And they do a survey on different property types in different areas of the country to see which they're recommending to buy, which they're recommending to hold, and which they're recommending to sell. And I think that really kind of illustrates a lot of the trends that we're seeing in retail. Because as you can see, power centers, and a power center is a place where you'll have maybe a Costco and a Home Depot, and a Hobby Lobby. These big box stores that are unrelated, but they're all in the same location. Your regional malls with your department store anchor, there's only 5% of the respondents there are recommending buys there. Far more of them are recommending that those are the types of assets that you want to dispose of. Outlet centers where you have your outlet stores, they're doing a little bit better. But then when you get to some of the other categories like lifestyle entertainment centers, so these are the places that kind of look like a little Main Street village where you have your theater and your gym and maybe a couple of restaurants, that type of thing. Those are actually faring a little bit better. There's a little bit more buy recommendations there. Mostly hold. And then if you get to your neighborhood shopping centers and your Main Street shopping centers and those districts in your last two slides, there the situation is much better. There's actually, in the case of the urban high street, there's actually more people recommending buying those types of assets rather than selling them. So those parts of the retail market are actually doing quite well. And so when you kind of distill this down and think, what are the real estate experts really kind of saying? Well, it's not like brick and mortar retail is dead or even dying, but it is undergoing some significant change. We're seeing some slight upticks in vacancy in some areas, but overall the vacancy rate is really pretty good. Overall rent growth is there. It's maybe a little bit anemic and maybe a little bit less than we're seeing in other property categories, but it isn't decreasing either in a lot of cases. One of the other things that was interesting is that you hear a lot about store closures, especially the department stores, and they're really big news when they happen. But when you actually drill down into the statistics, move-ins into malls are actually still outpacing move-outs. Now the spread between the move-ins and move-outs have been narrowing, so that's a little bit of an ominous sign. But sometimes when somebody backfills one of those spaces that gets occupied, it's not as big a news, but that is happening. As Natalie mentioned, not surprisingly, the retail markets that are struggling the most are the ones that are probably a little bit more challenged economically, where you're seeing job growth, income losses, or maybe even in some cases population declines. But it's not all bad news for retail. There are some real positive changes, and you see it in the proliferation of the lifestyle centers, more dining options, and when you get into areas like health and fitness, personal grooming, restaurants, those are areas that are growing, and they really can't be replicated, at least not yet, in the online world. So some of those areas are a little bit more insulated from some of those types of impacts. And the other thing that's really happened is the construction activity in retail is happening, but it's been somewhat constrained. So we're not adding a lot of supply. So that's also been somewhat supportive of higher values and therefore higher assessments. So those are some of the macro issues that are going on. So, and so generally speaking, brick and mortar retail from a property tax perspective is doing fairly well. But there are those sectors that we talked about that are struggling a little bit more. And specifically the malls. And one of the things that's very interesting about the malls is that once you start seeing some of those stores close, and if you're in an area where you're not getting the backfill, the valuations of those types of assets can decline, and they can decline quickly. So I brought up a couple of quick examples here. One is the Bangor Main Mall. There, the owner of the mall is seeking abatements of about $32 million. That mall makes up about half the retail space in Maine, so it's a pretty significant portion of their tax base. Typical story where the Macy's and the Sears stores closed. The mall was recently appraised by a lender at $28.9 million. As recently as 2007, it was appraised at $128 million. So for a city like Bangor, that's a pretty big drop. That means that they have to make up those property tax revenues, either by raising the rate on everyone else or an actual reduction of revenue. So that could be, quite an impact on a community. We're also seeing some struggling malls having difficulty paying their property taxes. So there's an example in DeWitt, New York, where a mall owns $5.7 million in back taxes, and it's facing foreclosure by the county. And there, sort of the same thing. The assessment went from $53 million to $36 million in 2014. And the taxpayer in 2017 was arguing for a value of only $14 million. So, those are just some examples. If you are if you do represent a community where there is one of these types of facilities and it is struggling, it can have a big impact on the tax base. So you might be getting some phone calls from some of your constituents saying, hey, why are my taxes going up? Or, why are we seeing these cuts in services? And they could certainly be caused by that type of issue. It's not just, though, the malls that have issues, and I wanted to highlight a couple of other things that are happening in the property tax world. One is vacant storefronts. This is very interesting. Even though the Main Street retail areas are generally doing very well, you still are seeing some vacancy in some of those areas, and there's a feeling that a lot of landlords are really kind of holding out, leaving storefronts vacant. Maybe they have a tenant that isn't paying the rent they want, that they let that business go, that their lease expires, and then the space stays vacant for a while. Boston Reporter recently found 50 vacant storefronts on Newbury Street. If you're familiar with Boston, that's kind of our high-end shopping street. The New York Post noted some significant vacancies on the Upper West Side and on Broadway in the Soho area. And it's getting to the point where public officials and people in these districts are very concerned because a vacant storefront doesn't generate foot traffic, doesn't bring people to the area, so it can really be a drag on the area. In New York, I know they're actually considering a vacancy fee that would try to combat that issue. One last topic I wanted to talk about is I don't know if any of you have dealt with this in your jurisdictions, the so-called dark stores. Very ominous, dark stores. I don't really like that term. It's really the issue of how do you deal with big box stores. So that's one of the changes that we have in the retail environment is we certainly have a lot more big box stores that are out there. And they really kind of present a unique valuation challenge for assessors because they're generally built specifically to the needs of the one tenant. A Lowe's will have one specific way that they want their buildings to be built with specific features for them. And assessors believe that those types of special features should be reflected in the assessment and the assessed value of the property. The retailers are saying, no, the standard is really value. And just because we pay to do that, if I went to sell the property, the person who bought it, if they're not going to put a Lowe's there, they don't want any of those things. It's actually going to cost them money to renovate the property. So the property is actually worth less than what it costs to construct. So it gets into some kind of esoteric arguments, but there's a lot of states that are really kind of struggling with this. I know that I've seen cases in Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Alabama, where there have been some pretty significant reductions in the valuations of these because of court decisions, and states are wondering what to do. And the local officials are arguing, hey, if we reduce the taxes on these big box stores, everybody else is going to have to pay more. And the big box stores are arguing, hey, we just want to be treated on the same fair market value standard that everyone else is. So as I said, this is really kind of focused a little bit in the Midwest right now, but I have heard about it in other places. And there's some legislative solutions that have actually been pursued. Some of those, it tries to get at some of the extreme cases where some of the big box store owners are actually trying to use vacant stores as comparables. So there's at least some disclosure requirements that are in place so that when people go to court and they have comparable sales, they have to disclose whether or not the property was vacant or not and what were the conditions of those vacancies. Because in some cases, some of these stores, when they negotiate their leases, they actually have provisions where they can't lease the property to a competing store. So it really leaves the property being vacant for a longer period of time and therefore less valuable. Others want to really just redefine market value to reflect the unique properties of these, or the unique characteristics of these properties. I think that's a little bit more of a slippery slope because you could start running into some constitutional issues, and sometimes you have some unintended consequences when you start doing that as well. But it's an issue that's been out there, and again, something that's emblematic of some of the changes that we've been seeing in retail. So thank you very much for your attention. I guess the big takeaway here is that, well, brick and mortar retail isn't dead, and it's still generally doing pretty well. There are segments where these big changes are taking place that are struggling a little bit more, and I think those are the ones that in your communities you really kind of need to keep an eye on. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Finally, I would like to introduce Fred Nice. Mr. Nicely is Senior Tax Counsel for the Council on State Taxation, which works to preserve and promote equitable and non-discriminatory state and local taxation of multi-jurisdictional business entities. Before joining COST, Fred served in the Ohio Department of Taxation for 4 years as Deputy Tax Commissioner over legal, and for the prior 7 years as the department's Chief Counsel. He's a frequent speaker on multi-state tax issues, and those on NCSL's state and local tax force will likely know him for his expertise on sales tax topics. Welcome, Fred.
Thanks, Jackson. I really appreciate being invited here. It's great to see a good audience here to talk about these different issues impacting the retail industry. And if you're a state and local tax geek, I assume a lot of you are because you're here at this session and all, we live in very exciting times. But we also, I need to really stress, is we live in some really uncertain times because we have this decision that came down from the U.S. Supreme Court just a little bit over a month ago. It was June 21st, 2018, and it was really a game changer in the sales and use tax area where the U.S. Supreme Court, for over 50 years, it's actually been, at least probably 70 years, the court has pretty much used a physical presence test for when remote sellers are required to collect a state's tax where they do not have a physical presence. Now, physical presence doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a store there. Physical presence can also be achieved by the fact that you have an agent that is operating to help a seller in a state. So, physical presence was the law of the land, but it is no longer. The test right now, as espoused by Justice Kennedy, is if the business has an economic or virtual. So over the internet, and you have your showroom on the internet, a virtual presence can be sufficient. And we heard some talks from Ron talking a little bit about leveling the playing field. And leveling the playing field is something that's really important. There's been a constant struggle between the brick and mortar stores and even the brick and clicks. Those are the retailers that also have .com entities. They, back in around 2005, they really started collecting tax, both, they had to for the retail stores and also for their .com stores. But you had the other segment of e-commerce that was, being very careful and limiting their footprint and making sure they didn't have physical presence in a lot of the states. And so that was a lot of the battle for the level playing field. And, is this decision, the Wayfarer decision, is it going to be, the savior for the retail stores and, keeping the values up or having them increase? We don't know yet. I think that, it could be a good discussion and interested in other folks' comments. I think it's too early to say. I think a lot of folks like buying things over the internet and completely eliminating that behavior simply because you're going to have almost all the internet sellers now collecting a tax. It's not sure that that's going to drive everyone back to the stores. I do want to personally, though, when you look at the Wayfarer decision, the NCSL was intimately involved in this process. And Jackson, I know you've attended many of those state and local task force advisory committee meetings and all. And Max Belkey is the one that really leads that up now. They gave a great over an hour discussion yesterday on a lot of the Wayfarer issues. But it was really, that state and local task force and Senator Deb Peters from South Dakota, your former president of the NCSL, she was really instrumental in getting this all up and going. Having a case go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2 years, and having the court overturn some precedent that's been out there clearly for over 50 years, that's not something that's easy to do. But it really was the states working on the state and local task force that were really key in putting a strategy together on how to do this. So I give them a lot of kudos for being able to do that. And Natalie had mentioned the figure, what is the loss that some of the states have had because you've had internet sellers not collecting the state's taxes. It's a wide range. Incredibly, the estimates from the GAO, and this was in the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, was $8 billion to $33 billion. Now, any additional revenue, that's good. The states look forward to that. But $8 billion to $33 billion, a $25 billion spread, that's, a lot of a difference there. So I think, a lot of the states, you as legislators, you have to be a little cautious on what you do with that and see, what's going to happen with the revenue that comes in. I know, a lot of folks, they want to be able to reduce taxes or use it as an enhancement to the revenue base, but we're just not certain, with that spread in the revenue estimates on exactly what states are going to bring in. And as you know, a lot of the big internet sellers over the past couple of years, they've kind of given up the nexus fight and they've moved towards collecting the state's taxes. So I'm just going to real quickly, cover some of the history of, how did we get to the Wayfarer decision, and I think it's important to really go back to, how do we get the, the broad number of states that have a sales tax? We have 45 states out of 50. DC also has a sales and use tax. It really stems, most of the states' sales and use taxes come from the Depression era. California state we're in, put in its sales tax in the early 1930s. Ohio, where I'm from, they put their sales and use tax in the 1930s. So it was really, during the Depression era, it was an enhancement to bring in more additional revenue to the states. And it worked very well. We're a consumption-based economy, and back then, people were purchasing a lot of tangible personal property. But one of the frustrations that we see in the sales tax base is that over time, if you look at where we're at now, we have more people that are purchasing services, which don't fit under the sales tax base as easily as you do with sales of tangible personal property. So even though you're seeing some more sales tax revenue being collected, there's still, if you look at the service economy, especially when we're looking at sales to end user consumers, you and I, like getting haircuts and all, a lot of the states haven't gone there to pick up that as part of the tax base. But you had in the 1930s, the states imposing the sales tax very quickly. The sales tax in general, it's imposed on the retailer. They're forced to collect the tax based on the sales price of a product. Very quickly, the states realized they also need to have a complementary use tax. And that is, what do you do with people who buy something from outside the state? Maybe the other state didn't have a sales tax and bring it in. You're avoiding the tax. And that's when states all very quickly put in a use tax concept. And there's questions before the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1940s on whether or not that was constitutional. And in 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court addressed about 3-4 cases, and they ultimately upheld that the use tax that the states have, it is complementary to their sales tax, and it was constitutional. And in those cases, you kind of get a sense. The court didn't directly say that physical presence was the law of the land, but it really looked at, where is the seller located. But I think the first case that, really hit it pretty solid, everyone talks about Bellis Hess out of Illinois, but I would say it really goes back to Miller Brothers from 1954, and that's where the court took on a case where you had a seller in Delaware that was advertising a lot to Maryland customers saying, come in and buy our furniture from our store, we're not going to impose you the Maryland sales tax. And at that time, the court, held that advertising was not sufficient enough. But where the court made it very clear, that they were using physical presence as the test, that was in 1967, and that was the Bellis Hess case. Out of Illinois. And then there was a lot of excitement in the really late 1980s and early 1990s on whether or not, the court would reverse that. And, you look at that time period, that's before you have the internet going on. What was going on in the late 1980s is you had an explosion of catalog sellers. Right? We all remember that. We used to, buy things using the catalogs. So the states, were very concerned then that they were losing a big portion of their revenue base. So there was a case that went up. Again, this was one that was very strategized. North Dakota is the one that took the lead. And, the states were anticipating that the U.S. Supreme Court was going to give them collection authority over the catalog companies. And unfortunately, it didn't happen at that time. Here we are 26 years later, and it was teed up, and, all of a sudden, you have the U.S. Supreme Court saying, we realize that, we were wrong. The physical presence test simply doesn't work. Go to the next slide. This slide just, talks about, and shows kind of the frustration. And I think, when you're looking at the frustration, there is two subsets to this. First, you have to look at the mid to late 1980s, and that's doing with the catalog sales. And a lot of the states, they passed legislation similar to North Dakota, saying that if you're sending all these catalogs to us, you're filling up our landfills, we want to be able to get remote seller collection authority. And I'm not sure what I did here. Did I mess something up? Okay, it's just doing something weird. It's going to be really hard to read, but you'll have the slide material available. When that case, ultimately went up with the Quill decision, those states' laws, it said, the catalog sellers should be collecting their tax. They couldn't be enforced by the states. And then we had, the next threshold was going on with sales over the internet, and that's when we now, we have the implosion that occurred with the Wayfarer decision. And you had a victory for a lot of the retail stores that, always had to collect the state's sales taxes, and with the states that were missing the revenue there. It's not all over though. One thing that was mentioned yesterday is that when you're dealing with the marketplace providers, Amazon, eBay, there's still a question over whether or not those providers should be actually collecting and remitting the tax on behalf of the sellers, or whether or not the sellers should be doing it. So all is not over. That's why I said there's still a lot of uncertainty out there. Okay, there we go. So the Wayfarer decision, it was a 5-4 decision. One thing I think is really important to make it clear is that all the justices, all 9, were really not comfortable with the fiscal presence standard anymore. The reason why it was a 5-4 decision is 5 of the justices, and the big surprise for me was Alito. I thought Alito would, probably be more conservative on the side of not changing stare decisis, but he did join the majority, and Justice Kinney, in their opinion, saying that, Quill and National Bell Assess, they've, served their time. They don't reflect the realities of the marketplace. And again, the test that they talked about is an economic virtual presence. And they didn't go into a lot of detail what they meant by that. They gave some examples, talked about how you can have showrooms on the internet that can actually show a lot more products than what you would be able to do actually in a physical store. So definitely have changed the test there. When you look at the Quill decision, if you're a person that's really interested in state tax law, in Quill, the court made it very clear that the due process clause was a different standard, and clearly these catalog sellers back at that time, they had a due process clause presence where they could be held to be subject to the state's jurisdictional powers. But then held under substantial nexus, looking at the Commerce Clause, the dormant Commerce Clause under the Constitution, that there wasn't sufficient nexus in that situation. That, I think, has really changed. The U.S. Supreme Court has pretty much said in the Wayfarer decision that the due process clause and the substantial nexus prong, when you look at the test for whether or not a business is going to be subject to a state's tax, they pretty much said, those are close to the same. They didn't say they're exactly the same, but they definitely said that they run parallel now. So I look at, what is the new test that the court's really going to focus in on, and what the state courts have to look at. And I think it's really looking at whether or not a tax is discriminatory, imposing an undue burden on business. And that's one of the reasons why in Wayfarer, the court made it very clear that fiscal presence is no longer the law of the land, but they did remand the case back to the South Dakota courts. And I'm not sure if there's going to be a settlement or if there's actually, going to be another hearing in South Dakota. Time will tell. But the court did say, that you need to look at the other, prongs under a 4-part test that the U.S. Supreme Court has, and one of them is, is it discriminatory and is it causing an undue burden? So the case was remanded back with that. But they said, the case said, the court said that we don't think there's probably going to be a problem here. There appears not to be a problem because, let's look at South Dakota's law. South Dakota's law, it has a transactional safe harbor. The U.S. Supreme Court didn't have any problems with South Dakota's transactional safe harbor. And also, South Dakota was, the law by design was very carefully crafted to make sure it was not going to impose a retroactive tax liability. And then last but not least, the U.S. Supreme Court specifically noted that South Dakota was a member of the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement and outlined some of the key benefits that provided and made it a little bit easier for remote sellers to be able to collect a tax. So dealing a little bit with the transactional safe harbor, what's been used by South Dakota, and you have probably another 5 or 6 states that are also using this, and that is 200 sales. If you have over 200 transactions, that's sufficient for the state in saying that you have a remote seller collection obligation, or if you just have over 100,000 in sales. Now, one of the big questions that's coming up is, when do you start imposing that? Is it for the entire calendar year? Is it only for that part of the calendar year when you actually go over? And one of the suggestions we have, and to you as state legislators, we really think it should be prospective. It should be, only at that moment when the taxpayer actually goes over. Because retroactive imposition, trying to go back to the beginning of the calendar year, how do those sellers collect the tax in that situation? And the purchasers who arguably have a use tax liability, some of those purchasers could have remitted the use tax to the state. I'm not promising them many have, but there is that possibility. So I think applying it prospectively is the best way to get around. One thing that's really interesting is that, there was a comment by the U.S. Solicitor General saying that, actually thought, one sale into a state should be sufficient to create nexus. The court didn't go there. The court, I think really highlighted that you do need to provide some protections for small sellers to make sure that you don't have an undue burden. But there is this big question with, what do you do with this threshold? We know South Dakota is not the most populous state out there in the country. California is much bigger by population. So when looking at the threshold, is that something that should be scaled? Should the 200 transactions, 100,000 in sales, should that be increased? If you have 10 times the population of South Dakota, maybe it should be 2,000 and $1 million. There's some arguments that have been made by some businesses, really pushing for making sure the threshold is scalable based on the state population. But I will also say other businesses, and I think some other states have said, isn't it a lot easier if you just have one threshold that what the standard is, because every state's going to be similar. And so that's, another path that folks have been leaning down. If we want perfect uniformity in this area, though, I think, we all know the only entity that's going to be able to do that is Congress. The U.S. Supreme Court, they, have indirectly blessed South Dakota's threshold and all. But as you all know, the U.S. Supreme Court is not a legislative body. They just, basically can bless something. They can't say that is the minimum standard. Just simply using the threshold. Retroactivity, again, this is something I think all of you as state legislators, you need to be very concerned with, making sure the law is set up like South Dakota where it's going to be prospective. And I think you need to make sure, even with the threshold, and when a seller goes over a thresh,hold that it's prospective. And remember, it is a fair balance, because a seller in the next year, in the subsequent year, they're going to have to continue to collect the state's tax, even if they don't go over the threshold in the way these threshold laws have been written. So it really does, I think, create a balanced approach to take that path. One thing to point out is, we're dealing with the Dormant Commerce Clause, and I don't have time to be able to go through all those details, but you do have 2 justices that they were part of the majority, but, one justice, Justice Thomas, has made it very clear he doesn't believe in the Dormant Commerce Clause. We don't have a federal law from Congress that broad-based says that states can't discriminate against interstate commerce. We have this development in the early 1800s from the U.S. Supreme Court imposing a Dormant Commerce Clause saying states can't impose. Now, there are some federal laws out there that directly say states can't discriminate, that protect the railroads, motor carriers, the airline industry, but no broad general law. Justice Gorsuch is kind of unknown. He just basically said that whether or not the Dormant Commerce Clause should still exist, that's really a question for another day. What steps will Congress take? Last week, there was actually a hearing in the House Judiciary when you have bills in Congress before the U.S. House, they go to the House Judiciary for their hearings. And I think it's safe to say that there was no consensus on exactly what Congress is going to do. I think there's a very mixed bag out there, and the legislation is out there. You have two bills. They've been out there for the last 2-3 sessions of Congress, the Marketplace Fairness Act and the Remote Transactions Parity Act. They would basically allow a two-path approach for the states to get remote seller collection authority. One is if you're a streamlined state, you would automatically be able to get collection authority, and the second would be the other states, you'd have to meet some minimum simplifications that are placed in the bill. If you look at, the states, I think, from the revenue agency side, a lot of the revenue agencies probably like the Marketplace Fairness Act better. If you look at the small seller community, I think they like the Remote Transaction Parity Act a little bit better, just because there's some audit protections that you have in that bill that you don't have in the Marketplace Fairness Act. There is a bill, though, that was been out there for at least a year, basically saying that we should retain Quill, and that you shouldn't be able to impose a tax unless you have a fiscal presence, and that's Representative Sensenbrenner out of Wisconsin, HR 2887, and then just recently, after the Wayfarer decision, there's a Senate bill, Stop Taxing Our Potential, the STOP Act. That was introduced in the Senate that reinforces that Quill should still be the standard. I'm not certain that there's really going to be any movement and all out there. I think some folks are really pushing for some uniformity. Overall, I think some uniformity would be really helpful, especially with setting what is the threshold. And another bill that some folks have thrown out there is, and this has been not introduced in the last 3 sessions of Congress, the Main Street Fairness Act, and that is it essentially requires states to be a member of the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Project to be able to get remote seller collection authority. One thing that we don't want to forget about, we're dealing with the retail industry here, so it's very property tax and sales tax specific, but you also have the state corporate income taxes out there and other business activity taxes. And what does this mean in that area? And that's something where, you may see Congress also look at, should we not only set thresholds for when states can impose their taxes against remote sellers for sales tax purposes, but it also come into play when states are trying to impose their tax for business activity tax purposes. And a lot of the states, over 10, have factor nexus provisions in their corporate income tax law or their gross receipts tax laws that they impose on businesses. And I think the factor presence provisions, they can be good as a radar screen for letting businesses know that you're expected, you're anticipated to be subject to that state's tax, but at the same time, it can't be an automatic threshold for asserting liability, in my opinion, because you still have the due process clause, and you have to show that a business has the requisite connections. The impact of Wayfarer, again, this is just highlighting what the court addressed about South Dakota and its membership in the Streamlined Sales Tax Agreement. Some of the things I think that are extremely important that are listed here: single state level administration. I think everyone agrees that's a lot easier to collect and remit the states and the local portion of the state's taxes if you have single state administration. And I give kudos to Arizona. Arizona, it was a process, but over about a 4-year process, they were actually able to get from having local and state administration of their sales tax and went all the way over to just having state administration. Colorado, Louisiana, in Alabama, those are the states that we're hoping we can get some movement, some improvement, and just have single state level administration. Uniform definitions, that's very important. Even if the state doesn't want to be a streamlined state, you can understand that there may be some concerns or issues. The more the states can use uniform definitions, digital products, that's something that's addressed in the agreement, that's extremely helpful. And simplified tax rate structures, tax base structures is very helpful too, where the tax base at the state and having the locals use the same base, that makes it a lot easier for both your in-state sellers and your remote sellers to be able to collect a tax when you have a sale from one jurisdiction to another. And that's something that Colorado now has a tax simplification workforce. They're working on that. Hopefully they'll be able to make some improvements there. But Colorado also has their state constitution that gives a lot of their local jurisdictions home rule authority. This slide right here, the Council on State Taxation, who I work for, we just recently put out our first scorecard looking at the state sales tax administration. Not surprisingly, the states that are part of the streamlined sales and use tax agreement, they did better. They had more uniform laws on the streamlined sales and use tax agreement. It does require single state level administration of the sales tax. So as a whole, they were a B state. And if you look at the non-streamlined states, those states fared a D+, so not as well. But we'd really like to see some improvement in the overall environment. You know, one thing to look at is exempt certificates. And some of the states impose a good faith requirement on exemption certificates to the seller, meaning the seller has to police whether or not the purchaser qualifies for an exemption. You know, if you're in that state, you know, you can probably be more grounded in understanding how the state exemption works in the law. But if you're a remote seller and trying to understand all the state's exemptions for, you know, agricultural or manufacturing, that's a very difficult burden. And it would be helpful if a lot of the non-streamlined states would look at removing the good faith requirement, because the streamlined sales and use tax agreement, it doesn't allow it, and the sky hasn't fallen. You know, the revenue, the sales tax revenue still comes in very strong. You know, what's next, now that we have Wayfarer out there, is the streamlined sales and use tax agreement, you know, is it still going to exist? You know, I think it will. I think, you know, they do have a registration system, and they're looking at providing that to the non-streamlined states. So I think that's something that's going to be able to help sellers collect the tax. They also, they already have a system using certified service providers that provide the software for small sellers to be able to collect and remit the tax. And the streamlined states actually pay the CSPs for the collection of that tax, where a small seller does not have a physical presence in the state. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the streamlined sales and use tax agreement. But, you know, one of the big problems is if you look at the big 6 states, they have 40% of the U.S. population, California being one of them, Texas, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Florida. You know, those states not being involved, I think that is going to be a hindrance, and hopefully we can get some of them to be able to join or at least adopt more aspects of the agreement. The MTC, you know, getting involved, I think that would be something that's very helpful, pushing for more uniformity. They are looking at the marketplace provider provisions, and if that all works out, you know, the streamlined states may be able to pick that up and actually put it in their agreement, required for 23 states. So with that, this last slide just shows the slides that have marketplace facilitator provider requirements. I think this is going to be the hot issue. A lot of you as legislators, I think, you know, you're going to have your revenue agencies, or you on your own are probably going to be looking, if your state does not have this, at actually looking at having some type of provision. And all I would stress here is that we hope the states can be as uniform as possible. Washington, Pennsylvania, their state laws in this area are very similar. It would be nice if we have the states take a uniform approach down this path. So with that, Jackson, I think that's the end of my slide, and I think we'd open up for questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Fred. Yeah, so we have a standing mic here for anyone who would like to pose the panel some questions. I'm happy to kick us off a little bit. Natalie, you briefly touched in your presentation on tax credits and states being careful not to give away the store. Obviously, with the Amazon bidding war, a lot of places still think being more generous with those incentives will ultimately pay off. So do you have any insights for us as far as credit strategies that have been more effective versus those that have not, and what states can do to get more bang for their buck?
Well, a number of years ago, I did a white paper at Brookings that was on business location decision-making that real estate entities within a lot of companies used in order to make decisions. And, you know, Amazon is sort of at the extreme level of that kind of bidding war. And ultimately, the tax incentives and the abatements were, a lot of real estate practitioners called them, quote, table stakes, because everybody's doing it. But what really matters is, your transportation facilities, your educational facilities, so that the proper employees can be found in the geographic area, the physical infrastructure that you've got, and so on. So I'm just putting that out as something to be really careful about. And then again, you're bidding, every state is bidding against each other. So from a macro perspective, it's not additive to the U.S. economy. It's just a business from one place to the next. And then again, there's, new disclosure, relatively new disclosure requirements, and that obviously makes it much more. There is a group out there called Good Jobs First that have listed the various revenues. Their methodology on the surface looks pretty decent. It's hard to pull together, but the various companies that have received multi-billion-dollar incentives from the various states and also from the federal government to locate, to expand, and so on. So just be careful. Look hard at it. I actually, go ahead. There's a question, sorry.
Mr. Nicely, you mentioned earlier when talking about South Dakota's transaction limit standards that if they do 200 sales, for example, then they're held to that standard. And is it correct, like you said, that doesn't reset the next year? If they make 2 sales the next year, they still have to collect those taxes? Does that ever reset?
Correct. So the way their law is written is that for the current year, if you go over 200 transactions or $100,000, you need to start collecting, and then you had to look back then that if you had in the prior year over 200 transactions, 100,000 sales, you have to collect. So you have 1 year, what I call trailing nexus.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Christian Beltran. I currently work with Senator Glazer's office with the California State Senate. One of the bills that my member worked on this year was SCA 20, which would change the allocation method from point of destination, from point of sale to point of destination. And one of the things that we encountered was that stakeholders were concerned that cities that have these tax share agreements that Natalie kind of touched upon, these tax abatements, would then be not obligated to continue entering into those tax share agreements with the current cities that they are located in. And that's basically because the revenues would shift from the city to other cities throughout the state. And in turn, what that could do is essentially reduce the credit ratings for those cities due to the lack of revenues going in, which then would lead to higher debt service payments. So my question is, what would be a good allocation method to look at in order to alleviate some of those concerns that some of those stakeholders had?
I wish I had the perfect solution for you. This has been something that's been a struggle within the Streamline Sales and Use Tax Agreement. Initially, Streamline was not going to allow origin sourcing. So let's make sure we're all on the same page here. When you have an interstate sale, all states are using destination. When they impose their sales tax on a sale from a seller in one state to a purchaser in another state. It's only when you're looking at the seller and the purchaser being in the same state, such as both being in California, some states use what's called origin sourcing. And I would just highlight to you that I think under the Wayfarer decision in the court, focusing in on, do you have a tax that discriminates against interstate commerce? That's a question that may be raised again with these origin states. And my former state, I was with Ohio. There's always that question of Ohio using origin sourcing. And initially, it had a case that came down from its state court saying it was unconstitutional. But Ohio subsequently, has adopted the streamline portions, and it hasn't been challenged yet. But I think that's somewhere you're going to see some additional litigation. As far as a cure, Ohio tried. It has the same problem with. It had a county in Ohio where 25% of its tax base was from a single seller of hardware. And all. So just a huge supplier throughout the state, and it made a huge impact if they would go to destination sourcing rather than origin sourcing. And it was tried for about 6 months to have a distribution formula. It didn't work, and ultimately Ohio went back to origin sourcing. I don't know if there's a perfect model out there.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Jason Straczewski, National Retail Federation. Really appreciate the discussions today. Shopping is vibrant. We're seeing a lot of growth. We appreciate the comments from several of you about the changes in the industry and that it's not really dying and it's just advancing and changing and very transformative. Natalie, we would agree with you. we're in a situation where we are overstored in the United States. There's about approximately 23 square feet of retail space per capita in the US, whereas in Great Britain, it's about 5 square feet of retail space. So anytime you have a situation where throughout the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, you had real estate developers building bigger, larger, if you build it, they will come, you're going to have a market correction, and we're seeing that happen. One of the points I'd like to make, I was speaking to a smaller retailer just last week. They started their business. He's a Marine with his wife. They started their business. They manufacture a product in North Carolina. They started selling it online and through the wholesale trades, and they've moved on to various online marketplaces. And just this past year, they tried to open their first retail store location in the state of California. They had a tough go of it, tough regulatory environment, higher wages, hard to get access to capital. They've actually moved out of state and are still looking to open their first store. That's just one of thousands of examples we've seen out there. So I'd urge a lot of the policymakers here and the legislators here that if you are in a community where you're seeing vacant storefronts, there's lots of small business people out there who either started their business bricks and mortar or online and are looking to grow, looking to get into those spots. So please look at your overall regulatory environment, and the property tax growth will come with that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. The models are also changing dramatically, as I'm sure you're very well aware, and some, you have stores now, like I'm thinking of Bonobos, where you have one size of each article of clothing. You go in there, you try it on, and sort of the joke is, you mean I can't walk out of the store with this? And well, no, because it's just a small shop, and then it's ordered online. It's going to be delivered to your home. So there's that kind of a model. Amazon is actually opening some bookstores in a number of places, which is odd. I'm not quite sure I understand that strategy. So there's a little bit of like inside out that's happening in terms of the model. And as we've talked about, the whole experience issue has come. I mean, we certainly have seen the movie theaters and events and whatever is going to attract people to the shopping location is changing that business model quite a bit. It's going to keep changing. What are we going to do with all those parking lots that are out there when we have Uber and Lyft and various online retailing and so on? There's a tremendous amount of extra land that is not utilized in some of the parking lots. So that's a whole other question.
Well, I guess I have one more.
Time?
We've got, I guess, time for one more. So obviously the Quill decision and the tax advantage it gave to online retailers was obviously hugely impactful to the industry. Jeff Bezos famously went to Washington to take advantage of it. Do you think the Wayfarer decision will be similarly impactful on the direction of the retail industry, or too early to tell at this point?
Yeah, and I guess I'll start it off as I think it's too early to tell. I think you have a lot of people that are very used to the convenience of being able to shop on the internet. I do think it may help a little bit with the people who go into the brick and mortar stores and then run out to the internet to try to do some comparison shopping, and well, I don't have to pay sales tax if it's on the internet. So I think those folks that are just trying to look for the quote sales tax savings, because we all know technically that consumers should be remitting the consumer's use tax in that situation. I think it is going to reduce that a little bit, but there's a convenience element to it. And it has, you have the pendulum kind of swinging back and forth, where Amazon used to do everything it could to make sure they didn't have a physical presence in the states. Now they have the distribution centers in practically all the states. You had mentioned that they have the bookstores that they're opening up, physical bookstores. They own Whole Foods, so that's located in a lot of the states. So they do, have a trend going back towards the brick and mortar stores and not just being an e-commerce seller.
So I just want to, I was looking for this passage, which it kind of blew me away to see it in a Supreme Court decision